So in the last videos, I've taken us through the first 2 chapters of Job. That section, if you recall, is known as the prologue. And the next section we're going to get into is the dialogues and the discourses, the main section, the biggest section of the book itself. But before we get into that section, I want to come back and I want to ask some questions, some very important questions that we spoke about in the last videos, but we never really addressed head on. The big question you might be wondering and you might be asking is, what role does Yahweh play in the sufferings of Job? Why does Yahweh even allow Job to suffer at the hands of the Satan? So, okay, those are great questions, and we need to answer them. And I'm gonna give some simplified answers to those questions. There was a lot more that I could say about those questions, and there are a lot more answers I can give. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just gonna answer those questions on a kind of a more surface level way, right? So I hope they're satisfying to you. Okay, so the first question: what role does God play in the suffering of Job? If you remember that in chapter 1 and chapter 2, the Satan proposes to Yahweh that Yahweh stretch out his hand and strike everything that Job has. And if you remember, Yahweh responds by saying, "Behold, everything that he has is in your hands." And if you remember in one of the last videos, I mentioned that because Yahweh responds in the way that he does, it's safe to say that in some respects, Yahweh is declining the offer that the Satan is making. The Satan is saying, "Yahweh, you stretch out your hand to strike Job." Yahweh responds, "Behold, everything is in your hands," speaking to the Satan. So to me, it seems that Yahweh is actually declining to actively harm Job. Of course, now the question becomes, okay, so isn't Yahweh still allowing, in his sovereignty, allowing the Satan to harm Job? And the answer to that question seems to be clear. Yes, Yahweh is allowing the Satan to harm Job. But why does he do this? Why does Yahweh, who is a good God, why does he allow Job to suffer the way that he does? Even though God isn't actively causing Job's suffering, he is still playing a role in that suffering, right? And that role is maybe a passive role. He's allowing someone to harm Job. So let's think about this. Why did Yahweh allow the Satan to harm Job? Why didn't Yahweh, upon hearing the Satan's request and proposal to harm Job, why didn't Yahweh say, "Satan, stop. Get out of my courtroom if you're going to be talking like that"? And suppose the Satan didn't obey God and leave the courtroom. Well, it seems like Yahweh could have forced the Satan to leave the heavenly courtroom and be out of here. So why didn't Yahweh do that? Why did Yahweh even converse with the Satan here? Why did Yahweh engage in conversation with him? Well, to answer that question, one scholar has proposed a rather intriguing way of explaining it. This scholar made the comment one time in one of his writings. He said that had Yahweh used his brute force to make the Satan leave and done something like that, then all that would have done is have proven the Satan's point to begin with. What do we mean by that? Well, if you remember that before the Satan proposed to harm Job, the Satan told God, or actually asked God, a question. He says, "Does Job serve God for nothing?" And of course you remember that section where Job is accused by the Satan of basically being a religious hypocrite. The Satan is basically saying the only reason that Job serves God is because God gives him a whole bunch of great stuff. In other words, Job is a religious hypocrite. He is an insincere, pious man. He's not for real, right? He's a fake. He just worships God because God gives him stuff. Now, that's an accusation that Satan made against Job. But in making that accusation, if you recall, I mentioned that the Satan is also accusing God of something, implicitly, right? Well, what is that accusation? Well, the Satan is actually accusing God of purchasing worship. In essence, what the Satan is doing is saying, Yahweh, Job worships you only for your stuff, and you only have worshipers because you give them stuff. In other words, you purchase worship, Yahweh. In other words, you use your brute force, your brute power, to give things to Job, knowing full well that Job's going to give in return you worship, right? So again, with that in mind, and with that idea floating around in the back of your head, then it does seem that if Yahweh had forced the Satan out of the courtroom with his power, then of course Yahweh would have succeeded in doing that, because Yahweh is most high, he's most powerful, he's the creator of all, and so forth and so on. But it seems like all that would do is prove that, well, yep, Yahweh gets what he wants because Yahweh selfishly uses his power to get what he wants. He uses his power to shut up the accusers, and he uses his power to just simply assert his own way, and so forth and so on. So one scholar has proposed that as a reason why Yahweh declines to use his brute power to just, kick the Satan out of the courtroom. As I reflect on that option, I think, that's not unreasonable. I think that works, and so I've tended in the past to go with that explanation. I think it works, and I don't think there's anything unreasonable about it. So that being said, it seems like Yahweh, instead of using his brute force and brute power to just kick the Satan out, he does engage in conversation with Satan, and it seems to me, Yahweh has decided to defeat Satan not with power, not by his power, but by outsmarting the Satan. How is that? Well, here's what I mean. It seems that Yahweh knows a thing or two more than the Satan does. Specifically, Yahweh, he knows that Job, when he goes through suffering, he will not abandon his relationship with God. In other words, Yahweh knows that Job will be faithful in his relationship to God. In other words, he knows that Satan's wrong. Remember, the Satan says that if you take away your protection from Job, and if you take away your stuff from Job, then Job will curse you to your face. Well, Yahweh knows that's not true. So in some respects, Yahweh knows that no matter what happens, whether Yahweh continues to protect Job, or whether Yahweh removes protection from Job and allows Satan to attack him, no matter what happens, he knows that Job will be faithful to maintain his relationship with God. It is true that after Job suffers, he goes off the deep end on a few things, right? He says some things about God that just simply aren't true. He gets depressed and lonely and angry and upset with God, even, it seems, and he accuses God of a lot of bad stuff. Now, that's true, but one thing still can be said about Job. Even in that season of his life, he never abandons his relationship with God. He never says, God, I'm done with you. No, in fact, he says, God, I want to talk to you. I have some things to tell you. And they may not be nice, but I want to tell you things. My only point in bringing that up is to simply say, Yahweh knows that Job will never be unfaithful to him. So, no matter what happens, Yahweh wins. No matter what happens, Job will win in the end. And in fact, Job comes around in the end, and he admits that he learns a few things about God that he didn't know before his suffering. Okay, so what role did God have in the suffering of Job? It was a passive role, and Yahweh did allow the Satan to inflict Job with suffering. But even in light of all that, Yahweh knows that no matter what happens, Job will be fine. Job will win in the end. Yahweh will win in the end. In other words, the Satan, no matter what happens, is doomed to lose.